This is Forgotten Wars.
One sad day, a couple calves and their mother grazed on the veldt. Suddenly, a lone lion attacked, scattering the family trio. When one of the calves finally came from hiding hours later, it was already dark. The calf looked and looked and looked for its mother. Finally, when the day was at its darkest before dawn, the calf lay beside its mother. The morning came. The calf opened its eyes. There before the calf lay not its mother, but a lioness. The calf looked at the lioness, and the lioness looked at the calf. The calf looked at the lioness, and the lioness looked at the calf. The calf looked.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Jan would tell the story of the calf and the lion before bedtime to the smaller children of Mr. and Mrs. Cricker. The children would scream when they heard about the calf waking up next to the lioness. But then Jan would lull the children to sleep by repeating, "The calf looked at the lioness, and the lioness looked at the calf," over and over, slower and slower. Jan was born in 1870 on an important day for many Cape colonists, May 24th, the same birthday as Queen Victoria, the monarch who had presided over the British Empire since 1837. Jan was born to Jacobus and Cato, born into a family of farmers, a family who had farmed in the Cape Colony for 4 generations. Jacobus was a pillar in their local church and a vocal supporter of Jan Hofmeyr's Afrikaner Bond political party, also known as the Bond. Cato not only proved her mettle as a farmer's wife, but also carried an infectious love of learning that helped her ace pianoforte and the French language. From an early age, Jan loved to lose himself in nature. Biographer W.K. Hancock writes this about Jan, quote, "He shouted to the beasts and the birds, talked to the little creatures in the crevices of the rocks, played with the pebbles, and made love to the plants. He felt himself akin to these natural things, as if he and they belonged to the same family. Yet sometimes different moods swept over him, and he felt himself to be a separate and lonely being, who was using words which the pebbles and plants did not understand, who was no longer talking to the creatures, but talking to himself about them. It was religious teaching that first offered him an explanation of his experiences. Had he been without teaching, he might well have become an animist, discovering in every rock and tree a spirit akin to his own, or a pantheist, believing that God is everything and that everything is God. Indeed, he was prone throughout his whole life to lapse into the pantheistic heresy. But from the time that he became old enough to drive with his parents in their Cape cart to the Sunday congregations at Riebeek West, he heard from the pulpit of his uncle Botha a simpler doctrine. Although some dispute existed within the Dutch Reformed Church of that time, between the liberal and the literal interpreters of Scripture, it scarcely ruffled the quiet Swartland. Jan received as literal and sufficient truth the whole Bible story, from Genesis to Revelation, of God, nature, and man. Perhaps he absorbed, along with the story, some mental habits which Calvinist teaching tends to encourage. The habit, for example, opposing the most tremendous problems and of seeking the most sweeping solutions." End quote. Dr. Andrew Murray toured the Cape Colony in the 1870s leading religious revival events. Murray visited Riebeek West's congregation and led a service where many school children received Jesus as their Savior. Jan Smuts was one of those children. Jan's parents didn't think him ready for elementary boarding school until he was 12 years old. Jan caught up quickly. Before taking the school higher examination during his second year, Jan fell very ill for several weeks. Despite strict prohibitions against him reading during recovery, Jan had a 3-year-old boy in the house sneak him books. On examination day, Jan scored second highest, second only to a boy who was attending the school for his 7th year. Jan was driven. Jan loved reading. Jan read widely outside his school's curriculum. Jan buried himself in Greek to better understand the New Testament before he even turned 17. Whenever Jan returned to the family farm during school holidays and breaks, he dove into farm affairs head first. At age 16, Jan began attending college in Stellenbosch, several years after the conclusion of the Transvaal Rebellion, the First Boer War. Jan worked hard in the seclusion of his room at a boarding house to master Latin, Greek, mathematics, science, and English literature. He attended church twice a day on Sundays, and there taught a Bible class to colored boys. Jan found himself at Mr. and Mrs. Cricker's home time and time again, being called on by the younger children to tell bedtime stories, and feeling his heart pulled towards Issy. Issy Cricker also stood out academically because she pursued a college education, which made her a sort of unicorn in her time. Issy likely reminded Jan of his mother, as Issy could play the piano and sing very well, and loved German literature. Rumors started spreading among local college students that Jan and Issy were engaged, with Jan still 17. Smuts spent 4 years at Stellenbosch. He grew less shy. He joined the militia, wrote for the college magazine, and led the debating society. Cecil Rhodes visited the school in 1890. Jan made a speech on behalf of the student body that Cecil Rhodes still remembered fondly over 20 years later. Smuts won the Ebden Scholarship to Cambridge the following year. One of Smuts's examiners, philosopher Monsignor Kolbe, wrote the last word on Jan Smuts' time at Stellenbosch. Quote, "Many years ago, when I was examining in philosophy, a very thoughtful set of papers was sent in by a student of Stellenbosch. Other students in various years sent in papers equally good, one at least much better, but their philosophical education seems to have ended there. They reproduced the thoughts of others, but they did not think. Jan Smuts started with a handicap, but the germs of thought were there." End quote. In the winter of 1891, Jan sailed away to Cambridge in underwear he wore to keep him cool in the South African summer. Later famous British intellectual Bertrand Russell was in his second year at Cambridge, but Smuts had no chance of crossing paths with Russell or any other aristocrat attending Cambridge. Anyway, Smuts remained alone and aloof in a way at Cambridge. He preferred long walks in the less awe-inspiring countryside of Cambridge to playing sports or socializing much with other Cambridge students. Smuts also couldn't afford much to socialize. He couldn't even afford to buy woolen underwear in his first winter at school. Bank failures cut his scholarship value in half. Winning another scholarship still didn't bridge the gap between his needs and his means, but a professor at Stellenbosch helped support Smuts. Professor Murray did have Smuts take out a life insurance policy for the amount that he loaned Smuts, but remained both generous and respectful to Smuts as Smuts worked to pay back Murray's generosity. Smuts wrote in his early years at Cambridge about neo-Darwinian concepts like continuous creation and life force before they were in the intellectual mainstream. Yet Smuts also sought to reconcile and meld science and religion in his philosophical musings on science, history, and Christianity. But Smuts attended Cambridge to become a lawyer. Smuts did what few had ever done. He won the George Long Prize in Roman Law and Jurisprudence, an award only those with the highest distinction won, a prize that wasn't even awarded most years. He also grew devoted to reading anything he could find about Walt Whitman. Smuts even wrote his own book Walt Whitman, A Study in the Evolution of Personality, while in law school, but failed as he doggedly tried to find a publisher in England and later back in the Cape Colony. This rare failure aside, Smuts sought to make a name for himself in the smaller Cape Colony's legal ecosphere. Little appeared different to Smuts in the Cape Colony's political climate when he returned. The Bond remained the dominant party, Cecil Rhodes the preeminent premier. Joseph Chamberlain had just returned to Cape Town as the new colonial secretary. When Smuts tried to build his legal reputation, he made ends meet by writing articles for various publications of conciliation and cooperation. Smuts delivered a speech advocating Bond policies and defending the policy of Rhodes on every front. He argued that white people of South Africa had power over the natives of Southern Africa, power that needed to be wielded responsibly. If whites oppressed the natives, whites would endanger themselves. If whites didn't try to uplift natives, white civilization would be dragged down to barbarism by the natives. Some natives, he argued, had progressed enough to be considered civilized, but most hadn't. The Cape Colony's Attorney General, W.P. Schreiner, yes, Olive Schreiner's brother, congratulated Smuts for the speech in letter, but completely disagreed with Smuts's assessment of Rhodes' trustworthiness. Schreiner commented to his wife about Smuts's speech, saying, "He is very earnest and sincere, but he doesn't know Rhodes." Then in December of that year of 1895, part of Smuts's world collapsed with the failed Jameson raid. Why? Many of you already know all about the Jameson raid, and some of you are hearing about it for the first time. We will get to the Jameson raid in a later episode. Just know that Cecil Rhodes, whose origin story you heard in episode 5, had his fingerprints all over this raid, and that this raid lost Rhodes so much power and goodwill across southern Africa. And know that Smuts took a while to recover from the Jameson raid. When Cecil Rhodes' involvement in the raid was established beyond a shadow of a doubt that Rhodes had betrayed the Cape Colony as its prime minister, Smuts had this to say about Rhodes in July of 1896, quote, "The Dutch set aside all considerations of blood and nationality and loved him, and trusted him, and served him because they believed that he was the man to carry out that great idea of an internally sovereign and united South Africa in which the white race would be supreme, which has been the cry of our forefathers even as it is our cry today. Here at last our Moses had appeared, and it made no difference that he was an Egyptian in blood. It was hero worship, pure and simple." End quote. For a time, Smuts groped to find a cause worthy of his full loyalty again. He also struggled to find a steady job that would make it feasible for him to marry Issy and pay his debts to Professor Murray. Jan applied to be a professor at the South Africa College only to see a middle-aged lawyer get the position. If you like alternate history and know who Jan Smuts became, consider this. What if 25-year-old Smuts had won this professorship at the South Africa College? How different could South Africa's history have unfolded if Jan Smuts achieved his early goal of becoming a professor? We will never know. Instead, Smuts halved his debt to Professor Murray by writing a variety of publications, most profitably for the Telegraph. Jan's heart eventually guided him away from the Cape Colony to the Transvaal. He began to scrutinize British policy towards South Africa even more. Smuts took stock of his political prospects in the Cape Colony. Smuts decided there was more opportunity and leadership he could believe in again in the Transvaal, despite criticism he'd leveled at Kruger at the Transvaal in previous months. But Jan's heart also led him to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Cricker near the end of April 1897. Jan asked to marry Issy the next day. He asked to finally marry the woman he had been committed to for 10 years before he traveled again to the Transvaal. Professor Murray married the two. Jan and Issy lived in their first home together in Johannesburg. This home, decades later, was torn down to make way for the headquarters of the United Party, the political party Jan would eventually lead. They were reportedly a happy couple, but faced tragedy early. The joy of birthing twins in 1898 turned to sorrow just a few weeks later when those twins died. In June 1898, Jan and Issy moved to Pretoria after Jan was appointed the Transvaal state attorney. So how did a 28-year-old with so little experience practicing law in the Cape Colony become the Transvaal state attorney? Somehow Jan made a name for himself in the 18 months he'd spent in Johannesburg. When he joined the Society of Law Teachers there, he is said to have told his pupils that they were a part of a consecrated priesthood, working in a worthy manner for the attainment of the highest ideals of humanity. Some thought him idealistic. However, the legal community in Johannesburg and later Pretoria respected Jan's integrity and intelligence. Someone who emerged as Jan Smuts' foe in 1899 had this to say about Jan, quote, "I am inclined to think him high-minded as he is certainly able, but whether he has real staying power and real political insight, I have no idea." End quote. A sort of villain in our story, Alfred Milner, said these words. Time would prove Smuts had political insight and staying power in spades. President Paul Kruger, in his typical form of humor, started things off on a rather unconventional foot when Jan came to take his oath of office as state attorney. Upon meeting Jan and Issy, Kruger exclaimed to Jan, "Whatever were you doing to marry such an ugly woman?" Then Kruger turned to Issy and exclaimed, "And whatever were you doing to marry such an ugly man?" Guess you had to be there. Kruger was definitely impressed by Smuts, all joking aside. He wrote in his memoirs about seeing Smuts as a man with an iron will who would play a major role in South Africa's history. Despite a giant intellectual gap between the one-book reading Kruger and Smuts, Smuts described their relationship like a father-son relationship. Smuts showed steadfast loyalty to Kruger through thick and thin. He took Kruger's side in a clash with the Transvaal Supreme Court's Chief Justice. He grappled with British arch-nemesis Alfred Milner while trying to walk a tightrope, keeping the Transvaal free to self-govern and avoiding war with the mighty British Empire. No one could have walked this tightrope successfully. I also wonder how many at the time would have predicted that this 28-year-old Smuts would take up arms and become a commando leader, a lawyer turned warrior in the Second Boer War, less than 2 years into serving as state attorney. Smuts fought to the bitter end of the Second Boer War, enduring disappointment, deprivation, and danger with his dwindling commando. What's more ironic? What if I told you Jan Smuts would appear a traitor to some South Africans who branded him a Judas, a traitor, just 15 years later? And that Smuts would serve as a member of the British government's Imperial War Cabinet and become the handyman of the empire, especially during World War I. And that Smuts would serve as South Africa's prime minister after World War I, and then again after World War II. We will get back to the middle of Smuts' story soon. His story is deeply woven into the months leading up to the Second Boer War. If you liked the version of the show that you got today that had no commercials and no requests for ratings or subscribing or anything like that, consider going to our Support the Show page and giving us $50. Just make sure that you note on your $50 donation that you want all of our 40-plus episodes free of any requests for ratings, reviews, and free of any commercials. And you'll have it. Take care, everyone.